The cold winter night wrapped around the small town of Millbrook like a frozen blanket. It was 2 a.m., and Officer Sarah Martinez was doing her regular patrol in her warm police cruiser. The streets were empty, except for a few stray cats that quickly disappeared into the shadows when her headlights swept past them. As she drove past Jerry's convenience store, something caught her eye. A dark blue Honda Civic was parked in the far corner of the parking lot, its engine running. White clouds of exhaust puffed steadily from the tailpipe into the freezing air. At first glance, it might have seemed normal, but Sarah had been a cop long enough to trust her instincts when something felt off. She pulled her cruiser into the parking lot, positioning it at an angle behind the Honda. Her trained eyes quickly noticed the veteran license plate, slightly dirty but still readable in her headlights. As she stepped out of her vehicle, the bitter cold bit at her face, making her pull her police jacket tighter around her body. Sarah approached the car carefully, her right hand resting naturally near her holstered weapon, a habit from years of training. Through the foggy windows, she could make out the shape of someone slumped over the steering wheel. The car's heater was running full blast. She could hear its fan whirring loudly. Using her flashlight, she illuminated the interior of the car. The beam revealed a man, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a thick gray hoodie with a Marine's logo on the back. His head rested awkwardly against the steering wheel, and his breath created small patches of fog on the windshield. "Central, this is Officer Martinez." She spoke into her radio. "I'm at Jerry's convenience store on Main Street. Got a 10 to 56 possible, one occupant. Running plates now." She read off the license plate number and waited for dispatch to respond. While waiting, Sarah noticed more details about the scene. Empty food wrappers were scattered on the passenger seat, along with what looked like prescription bottles. At least 3 or 4 of them. Her mind immediately went to the worst possibilities. Drug overdose? Suicide attempt? DUI? "Copy that, Officer Martinez." The dispatcher's voice crackled through her radio. "Plate belongs to a James Cooper, 34 years old. Vehicle registration is current. No outstanding warrants." Sarah nodded to herself and took a deep breath. The situation needed to be handled carefully. Too many times, she'd seen similar scenes end badly. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the veteran plate, or maybe it was the way the man's hoodie reminded her of her father's old Marine Corps sweatshirt that still hung in his closet back home. She tapped on the window with her flashlight, the sound sharp in the quiet night. No response. She tapped again, harder this time. The man stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. Sarah's concern grew. She tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Carefully, she opened the driver's door, immediately feeling the blast of hot air from inside the car. Sir, can you hear me?" She called out, her voice firm but not threatening. The man suddenly jerked awake, his whole body tensing. His quick movement caused Sarah to take a step back, her hand instinctively moving closer to her weapon. But what she saw in his eyes wasn't aggression or intoxication. It was fear, confusion, and something else she recognized from seeing it in her father's eyes. The haunted look of someone who'd seen too much. What's going on?" he mumbled, his eyes darting around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. "Sir, I'm Officer Martinez with the Millbrook Police Department," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Are you okay? Can you tell me your name?" The man blinked several times, seeming to become more alert. James Cooper," he said, his voice hoarse. He started to move, and that's when Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The way he shifted in his seat wasn't natural. There was a stiffness to his movements that didn't match with someone who was just drowsy or possibly intoxicated. Sarah's flashlight beam caught the prescription bottles again, and now she could read part of a label. VA Hospital Pharmacy. Her gut feeling shifted. This wasn't a typical late-night drunk or drug user. This was something else entirely, and as she prepared to ask Mr. Cooper to step out of the vehicle, she had no idea that the next few minutes would change both their lives forever. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," Officer Martinez said, her voice remaining professional but firm. The winter wind whipped around them as James Cooper slowly turned in his seat to face her. "Is there a problem, officer?" James asked, his words clear but tired. Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly, though not in the way she usually saw with drunk drivers. This trembling seemed different, more like her father's hands after a particularly bad nightmare. I need to make sure you're okay to drive, she explained, shining her flashlight around the car's interior again. The prescription bottles caught her attention once more. Have you taken any medications tonight, Mr. Cooper? James's face tightened. I have my prescriptions right here, he said, reaching slowly toward the passenger seat. Sarah tensed automatically, but James's movements were deliberate and careful, clearly trying not to alarm her. Please keep your hands where I can see them, Sarah instructed, following protocol. We'll get to the paperwork in a moment. First, I need you to step out of the vehicle. James nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, he said, and began to turn in his seat. That's when Sarah noticed something that made her breath catch. As James moved, his left pants leg caught on something, revealing a glimpse of metal and plastic beneath. The car door creaked as James pushed it wider. He gripped the door frame tightly, using it to pull himself up. Sarah watched as he struggled to stand, her trained eyes noting every detail. His right leg took his weight normally, but his left leg moved differently, mechanically. Do you need assistance? Sarah asked, her voice softening slightly despite her professional training. No, ma'am, I can manage, James replied, finally standing upright. He was tall, over 6 feet, but he seemed to be trying to make himself appear smaller, less threatening. In the harsh beam of the cruiser's headlights, Sarah could now clearly see his prosthetic leg extending from his left knee down. Sir, I'm going to need to perform a few sobriety tests, Sarah said, though her certainty about the situation was beginning to waver. Those medication bottles? They're from the VA, James interrupted, then quickly added. Sorry for cutting you off, officer, but they're all prescribed. For pain, and, he hesitated, looking down at the ground, other things. Sarah noticed how he stood at almost attention, despite his obvious discomfort. VA prescription or not, sleeping in your car with multiple medication bottles is something I need to check out. Can you walk in a straight line for me? A bitter laugh escaped James's lips, but it held no humor. Ma'am, I can try, but with this leg. He gestured to his prosthetic. It's not going to be very straight, especially not in this cold. The metal doesn't work so well when it's frozen. Sarah felt her certainty crumbling further. The signs she'd initially read as intoxication were taking on new meaning. The slight sway in his stance wasn't from alcohol. It was from fatigue and cold affecting his prosthetic. The trembling in his hands wasn't from drugs. It was from something deeper, something she recognized from years of living with her veteran father. Mr. Cooper, why were you sleeping in your car? She asked, her tone shifting from authoritative to concerned. James straightened his back, pride evident in his posture despite his circumstances. Officer, I'd rather not. He started, but then his shoulders slumped slightly. The VA, they're processing my benefits. Again. There was a mistake in the paperwork, they said. 4th time this year. Sarah's flashlight beam caught something else in the car, a duffel bag in the back seat, clothes spilling out of it. A military-issue blanket was crumpled beside it. How long? She asked quietly. A week? James replied, his voice barely audible over the winter wind. The choice was rent or meds. Can't sleep without the meds, can't work without sleep. Figured the car was better than. He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. She should have been writing a ticket, or worse, making an arrest. That's what protocol would suggest for someone sleeping in their car with multiple prescription bottles. But as she stood there in the cold, watching this proud Marine veteran trying to maintain his dignity while this whole world was falling apart due to bureaucratic red tape, Sarah realized this situation needed something different than handcuffs and a police report. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Officer Sarah Martinez took a deep breath, fog forming in front of her face in the cold night air. The situation before her wasn't what she had expected when she first spotted the car. James Cooper stood quietly, his prosthetic leg visible now in the light from her cruiser's headlights. Would you mind showing me your military ID? Sarah asked, her voice gentler than before. She noticed how James was trying to hide his shivering in the bitter cold. Yes, ma'am, James replied, reaching slowly into his back pocket. His hands were still trembling, but his movements were precise, practiced. He pulled out his wallet and carefully removed his military ID card, handing it to her with steady respect. Sarah had examined the ID under her flashlight. The photo showed a different James Cooper, younger, clean-shaven, with bright eyes and a confident smile. The current James looked tired, with a week's worth of stubble and dark circles under his eyes, but his military bearing remained intact. Marines, 3 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah read aloud. She noticed something else on the ID, a designation that made her heart skip a beat. Purple Heart recipient. James shifted uncomfortably on his prosthetic leg. Yes, ma'am. 3rd tour, about 2 years ago. Would you mind telling me what happened? Sarah asked, knowing she was departing from standard procedure, but feeling this was the right path to take. James looked up at the night sky for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he looked back at Sarah, his eyes held a mix of pain and pride. We were on patrol near Kandahar, he began, his voice steady but quiet. Our convoy hit an IED. 2 vehicles were disabled. Then the shooting started. He paused, swallowing hard. We had 3 guys pinned down behind one of the burning Humvees. They couldn't move without getting hit. Sarah listened intently, her hand no longer anywhere near her weapon. The cold wind whipped around them, but neither seemed to notice any more. I was the squad leader, James continued. Couldn't leave them there. So I ran, made it to them, helped create a smoke screen. Got 2 of them out first. His right hand unconsciously moved to touch his left leg where flesh met prosthetic. Was going back for the 3rd when I stepped on another IED. Small one, thankfully. Still had enough leg left to drag Thompson out of there before the medevac arrived. You saved 3 lives, Sarah said softly. Did my job, James corrected her. We all would have done the same. Thompson's got 3 kids now. Robert's just made sergeant. Williams. His voice cracked slightly. Williams sends me a Christmas card every year. Says he named his son James. Sarah looked at the prescription bottles in the car, seeing them with new understanding. PTSD? She asked gently. James nodded. Among other things. The leg pain comes and goes, but the dreams? He trailed off, looking away. The meds help. Most nights, anyway. Can't risk not having them, even if it means sleeping in the car for a while. Sarah thought about her father, about the nights she'd heard him pacing in their house, about the medication bottles in their bathroom cabinet. She thought about how different his life might have been without their family's support system. Mr. Cooper, she said, making a decision, I have some contacts at the local Veterans Support Center. Good people who know how to cut through red tape. James straightened up, pride battling with desperation. I appreciate that, officer, but I don't need charity. Once the VA processes my paperwork. It's not charity, Sarah interrupted firmly. It's what we owe you. What this country owes you. And it's Officer Martinez, but you can call me Sarah. She saw something change in James's eyes, a tiny spark of hope breaking through the exhaustion. The center has emergency housing available, Sarah continued. Real beds, warm rooms, and people who understand what you're going through. People who can help speed up the VA process. She paused, then added, people who've walked in your boots. James stood silent for a long moment, his military bearing warring with his current reality. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah reached for her radio to make some calls, she knew this night would have a very different ending than she had initially thought. Sometimes, she realized, the best police work wasn't about enforcing laws. It was about helping people find their way back to solid ground. And this was just the beginning of their story. Sarah reached for her radio, her breath visible in the cold night air. Central, this is Officer Martinez. I'm going to be out of service for about an hour. Going to assist a veteran with emergency housing placement. Copy that, Officer Martinez, the dispatcher replied. Do you need backup? Negative, Central. Situation is under control. She turned back to James. Let's get your things from the car. It's too cold to stand out here any longer. James nodded, moving stiffly toward his Honda. The cold was clearly affecting his prosthetic leg more now. As he opened the back door, Sarah noticed how few possessions he actually had. 1 military duffel bag, a laptop bag, and a small box of what looked like photo frames and personal items. That's all? Sarah asked gently. Yes, ma'am, James replied, attempting to carry everything at once. Had to sell most things when the benefits got delayed. Kept what matters. Sarah stepped forward. Let me help with that. She reached for the duffel bag, but James hesitated. "I can manage," he said, but his prosthetic leg chose that moment to lock up in the cold, making him stumble slightly. "James," Sarah said firmly, "my father was a Marine. He taught me that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is accept help when they need it." Those words seemed to reach something deep inside James. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he let Sarah take the duffel bag. As she lifted it, a photo fell from a side pocket. Sarah caught it before it hit the ground. The photo showed James in his dress blues, standing proud and tall on two natural legs. He had his arm around an elderly woman who was beaming with pride. The photo's edges were worn, as if it had been handled often. "My mom," James said quietly, taking the photo and carefully tucking it away. "Taken at my graduation from boot camp. She passed away last year, while I was still in the hospital learning to walk again." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry," she said simply. James nodded, then reached into the car one last time, pulling out the prescription bottles. He read the labels carefully in the dim light, making sure he had all of them. Sarah noticed his hands were shaking more now, though whether from cold or emotion, she couldn't tell. "The Veterans Support Center is about 15 minutes from here," Sarah said, leading the way to her patrol car. "They have a 24-hour intake service for emergencies. I know the night manager, Mike. He's a Gulf War vet himself." As they walked to her cruiser, Sarah noticed James was looking back at his Honda. "Don't worry about your car," she assured him. "This is a safe area, and I'll make sure patrol keeps an eye on it until you can come back for it tomorrow." James settled into the passenger seat of the patrol car, his movements careful and measured. Sarah turned up the heat as soon as she got in, remembering how the cold affected her father's old war injuries. "Officer Martinez, Sarah," James said as they pulled out of the parking lot, "why are you doing this? You could have just written me up or worse." Sarah was quiet for a moment, navigating the empty streets. "Because 18 years ago, my father came back from Vietnam with wounds nobody could see. He had people who helped him find his way back. Now it's my turn to do the same for someone else." She glanced over and saw James staring straight ahead, his jaw tight with emotion. "The center doesn't just offer a place to sleep," she continued. "They have counselors, job placement services, and people who know how to navigate the VA system. They've helped hundreds of vets get back on their feet." "I never thought I'd end up like this," James said quietly. "Always had a plan, always took care of myself. Then one bad day in Kandahar, and everything changed." "Plans change," Sarah replied. "But that doesn't mean the story's over. Sometimes we just need a new chapter." As they drove through the sleeping town, Sarah realized this night had become about much more than a routine patrol check. It had become about honoring her father's legacy, about helping a warrior find his way home, and about remembering that sometimes the most important police work happened without a single arrest being made. The Veterans Support Center's lights grew visible in the distance, a beacon of hope in the dark winter night. The Veterans Support Center stood like a lighthouse in the darkness, its windows warmly lit against the cold night. Sarah pulled her patrol car into the empty parking lot, the headlights illuminating the building's sign. "Welcome Home Veterans Support Center, open 24/7." Mike Thompson, the night manager, was already waiting at the door when they arrived. He was a sturdy man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a Desert Storm veteran cap. Sarah had called him during the drive, briefly explaining the situation. "Welcome, Marine," Mike said as James stepped carefully out of the patrol car. His experienced eyes took in James' prosthetic leg and tired appearance without comment. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The center's lobby felt like stepping into a different world. The walls were covered with military unit patches, flags, and photos of smiling veterans who had found help here. A coffee pot bubbled in the corner, filling the air with its rich aroma. "Coffee's fresh," Mike said, gesturing to the pot. "Marine Corp's blend. Strong enough to wake the dead." For the first time that night, a small smile crossed James's face. "Been a while since I had real coffee, sir. Been living on gas station stuff." "Then let's fix that right now," Mike replied, already moving to pour 3 cups. "And drop the sir. I worked for a living. Mike's fine." Sarah watched as James's tense shoulders began to relax slightly in the warm, welcoming atmosphere. She helped bring his bags inside while Mike prepared the coffee. Sugar? Cream? Mike asked, but James shook his head. Black, like my soul, James joked weakly, and both Mike and Sarah smiled. It was a classic military humor response, and it felt like a small breakthrough. They settled into the comfortable chairs in the lobby. James wrapped his hands around the warm coffee mug, seeming to draw strength from its heat. So, Mike said, pulling out some paperwork, Officer Martinez filled me in a bit. Why don't you tell me your story, James? Over the next 20 minutes, James talked. He spoke about his 3 tours, the IED explosion, and his mother's passing while he was learning to walk again. He explained the VA paperwork delays, the choice between medications and rent, and the week spent living in his car. Mike listened carefully, occasionally making notes. When James finished, Mike set down his notepad and leaned forward. First things first, he said, his voice firm but kind. We got a warm bed for you tonight. Private room, shared bathroom down the hall. Kitchen's always stocked, and there's laundry facilities if you need them. James started to protest, but Mike held up a hand. This isn't charity, Marine. This is veterans helping veterans. Tomorrow morning, our VA liaison, Jenny, will look at your paperwork. She used to work at the VA, knows all the shortcuts through the red tape. I don't want to be a burden, James said quietly. Sarah, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. You carried 3 wounded Marines to safety while losing your own leg. You're not a burden, James. You're a hero who needs a hand up, not a handout. Mike nodded in agreement. We've got a whole program here. Job placement, counseling if you want it, housing assistance. But tonight, you just need to focus on getting some real sleep in a real bed. He pulled out a key and a small welcome packet. Room 204. Clean sheets on the bed, fresh towels in the room. Breakfast starts at 700, but no one will bother you if you sleep in. James looked at the key in his hand, then at Sarah and Mike. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you both. Thank us by getting back on your feet, Mike said. That's what this place is for. Sarah stood up, knowing it was time for her to go. I'll check on your car tomorrow, James, and I'll stop by in a few days to see how you're doing, if that's okay. James stood as well, military courtesy ingrained despite his exhaustion. More than okay, Officer Martinez. Thank you. For everything. As Sarah walked back to her patrol car, she glanced back through the center's windows. She saw Mike showing James to the elevator, saw how James was walking a little straighter now, his head held a little higher. Sometimes, she thought, the best nights on patrol weren't about enforcing laws. They were about changing lives. And tonight, she had a feeling, was going to change more than one. 3 days had passed since that cold night when Officer Sarah Martinez found James Cooper sleeping in his car. It was early morning, and Sarah was just finishing her night shift when she decided to stop by the Veterans Support Center to check on him. The morning sun was just beginning to rise as she parked her patrol car. Through the center's windows, she could see several veterans gathering for breakfast in the common area. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted out when she opened the door. Officer Martinez. Mike called out from behind the front desk. Perfect timing. James is just having breakfast. He's got some news you might want to hear. Sarah followed Mike to the dining area, where she found James sitting at a table with 2 other veterans. The change in him after just 3 days was remarkable. He was clean-shaven, wearing fresh clothes, and there was a new energy in his movements. Sarah, James said, standing up when he saw her. I mean, Officer Martinez. I was hoping you'd stop by. Sarah is fine, she reminded him with a smile. You're looking better. Amazing what a real bed and 3 meals a day can do, James replied. He gestured to the 2 men sitting with him. This is Tom and Ray, both Marines, different wars, same stories. The older man, Ray, nodded at Sarah. James told us how you found him. Good thing you were on patrol that night. Jenny, our VA liaison, has been working magic with James's paperwork, Mike added, pulling up a chair. Want to tell her the good news, James? James's face brightened. Jenny found the problem. Turns out there was a mix-up with my medical records from the field hospital in Germany. She made some calls, sent some emails, and, he paused, still seeming amazed, my benefits should be reinstated by next week. That's not all, Mike chimed in. Tell her about the job. The center has a partnership with local businesses, James explained. There's an engineering firm that likes hiring vets. They looked at my military experience with equipment maintenance, and they're interested in training me as a technical supervisor. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. This was the kind of outcome she had hoped for, but hadn't dared expect so quickly. The interview is tomorrow, James continued. Jenny helped me get my suit from my storage unit, and Tom here gave me a haircut. He ran a hand over his now neat hair. First real job interview since, he gestured at his prosthetic leg. You'll do great, Tom said confidently. That company's owner is a Vietnam vet. He understands what we bring to the table. And there's one more thing, James said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small chip, a sobriety chip from a veterans support group. Been going to meetings here at the center. Turns out I'm not the only one who struggled with the pain meds after getting hurt. The group? They get it. They understand. Sarah thought about her father, about his own struggles after Vietnam, and how having support had made all the difference. I wanted to thank you, James said seriously. That night, when you found me, I was in a dark place, really dark. If you'd just written me a ticket, or worse. He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. Instead, you took the time to listen, to help. You changed everything. You did the hard part, Sarah replied. You accepted the help. That takes more courage than most people understand. Officer Martinez, Mike said, we have a monthly dinner here at the center. Veterans, family members, people from the community who support our work. Would you consider being our guest speaker next month? Your perspective as both a police officer and a veteran's daughter. It could help build more bridges. Sarah looked around the room at the veterans eating breakfast, sharing stories, supporting each other. She thought about how many more James Coopers might be out there, needing just one person to take the time to listen and help. I'd be honored, she said. Great, Mike smiled. Now, who wants breakfast? Cook made his famous biscuits and gravy. As they sat down to eat, Sarah watched James joking with his new friends, saw how he was already becoming part of this community. Sometimes, she thought, the most important arrests were the ones that never happened, and the best police work was simply being human enough to see past the surface and help someone find their way home. 2 weeks had passed since James's first morning at the Veterans Support Center. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the engineering firm's office as James sat in the employee break room, looking down at his new employee badge with a mixture of pride and disbelief. He had gotten the job. Not just the entry-level position they had initially discussed, but a role as a senior maintenance supervisor. His military experience with complex equipment and leadership skills had impressed the company's owner, Mr. Richardson, another veteran who understood the value of military training. As James sipped his coffee from his new company mug, he thought about how much his life had changed since that cold night in his car. His first paycheck would be coming next week, and Mike had already helped him find an affordable apartment near the center. The VA benefits had been reinstated, just as Jenny had promised, and his back pay was being processed. The door opened, and Sarah Martinez walked in, still in her police uniform. She had been stopping by regularly to check on his progress, and today she had promised to join him for lunch during her break. Look who's moving up in the world, she smiled, noticing his new badge. How does it feel? Feels unreal, James admitted, pulling out a chair for her. 2 weeks ago, I was sleeping in my car. Now I have a job, an apartment lined up, and my benefits back. Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming. You earned this, Sarah reminded him, unpacking her lunch. All of it. James nodded, then reached into his work bag. I wanted to show you something. He pulled out a letter and handed it to her. It came this morning. Sarah opened the letter carefully. It was from the VA hospital, confirming his appointment for a new prosthetic fitting. The advanced model would allow for better mobility and less pain in cold weather. This is wonderful, James, she said, genuinely happy for him. There's more, James said, pulling out another piece of paper. The veterans support group I've been attending. They asked me to become a peer counselor. Said my story could help other vets who are struggling. Sarah watched as James talked about his plans to help other veterans, noting how his eyes lit up with purpose. The defeated man she had found in that parking lot was gone, replaced by someone who had found his mission again. Oh, and you remember those 3 Marines I helped in Afghanistan? James continued. I finally got back in touch with them through the center's network. Thompson's driving up next weekend with his family. Says his kids want to meet their Uncle James. Just then, Mr. Richardson appeared in the break room doorway. He was a tall man in his 60s, with kind eyes and a Vietnam veteran pin on his lapel. "Cooper," he called out, "got a minute? Want to get your opinion on some new equipment we're thinking of installing." "Of course, sir," James replied, standing up. His prosthetic leg moved smoothly. The center's physical therapist had helped him adjust it properly, making a world of difference in his mobility. "And Officer Martinez," Mr. Richardson added, "thank you for what you did that night. We got ourselves a fine employee because you chose to listen instead of judge." Sarah smiled. "Just doing my job, sir." "No," Mr. Richardson shook his head. "You went above and beyond. That's why I'd like to talk to you about a partnership program we're considering. Working with the police department to identify and help veterans in crisis. James here gave me the idea." James looked surprised but pleased. "I did. Your story got me thinking," Mr. Richardson explained. "How many other veterans are out there, needing just one person to take the time to understand? Maybe we can train officers to recognize the signs, know about the resources available." Sarah thought about all the possibilities. How many lives could be changed if more officers knew what to look for, knew how to help instead of arrest? "I'd be very interested in discussing that, sir," she said. As James followed Mr. Richardson out, he turned back to Sarah. "See you at the center's dinner next week. Mike says you're giving the keynote speech." "Wouldn't miss it," Sarah replied. "Someone once told me that sometimes the best stories are the ones that start with a second chance." James smiled, understanding. They usually are. 1 month later, the Veterans Support Center's main hall was filled to capacity. The monthly dinner had drawn its largest crowd ever, with police officers, veterans, business leaders, and community members all gathered together. The smell of good food and the sound of friendly conversation filled the air. Sarah Martinez stood at the podium, looking out at the faces before her. In the front row sat James Cooper, now almost unrecognizable from the man she'd found in that parking lot. He wore a crisp suit, his new advanced prosthetic leg allowing him to move with confidence. Next to him sat Thompson, who had driven 6 hours with his family to be here. "A month ago," Sarah began her speech, "I was on routine patrol when I found a Marine veteran sleeping in his car. Protocol said I should write a ticket, or maybe make an arrest." She paused, making eye contact with various officers in the crowd. "Instead, I listened. And that decision changed not just one life, but an entire community." The room was silent now, everyone focused on her words. "Since that night, something remarkable has happened," she continued. "Mr. Richardson's company has hired 3 more veterans. The police department has started a new training program to help officers recognize and assist veterans in crisis. And this center," she gestured around her, "has seen a 50% increase in veterans seeking help, because one story of hope led to another." In the audience, James sat straight and tall, pride evident in his bearing. His new job was going well, his apartment was furnished thanks to donations from the center's network, and his new prosthetic leg had given him back the mobility he thought he'd lost forever. "But the real story isn't about one night or one decision," Sarah said. "It's about what happens when we choose to see past our initial judgments. When we remember that behind every crisis, there's a human being with a story." She watched as several officers nodded in agreement. The department's new veteran crisis response program, inspired by James's case, had already helped 5 veterans find their way to the center instead of to jail. "I'd like to invite James Cooper to join me up here," Sarah said. James stood smoothly and walked to the podium, his new prosthetic leg working perfectly. James is now not only a successful engineering supervisor, but also runs our new peer support program for veterans struggling with similar challenges. James took the microphone, his voice steady and strong. "A month ago, I thought my story was over. I was sleeping in my car, out of options, out of hope." He looked at Sarah. Then this officer took the time to listen, to understand. She saw past the surface to the person underneath. Thompson stood up in the audience, his 3 children beside him. "James saved my life in Afghanistan," he called out. "And Officer Martinez saved his life here at home. That's what real heroes do. They show up when you need them most." Mr. Richardson stepped forward next. "Our veteran hiring program has been so successful that 3 other local businesses have asked to join. By this time next year, we expect to have jobs for 20 more veterans." Mike, the night manager who had welcomed James that first night, spoke up from his place near the door. And our new partnership with the police department means we can reach veterans before they hit rock bottom. Prevention is always better than crisis response. Sarah returned to the microphone for her closing words. The person you helped today might be someone's father, someone's son, someone's hero. They might be carrying wounds we can't see, fighting battles we don't understand. But if we take the time to listen, to help, we can change not just one life, but countless others. She looked at James, standing tall and proud beside her. Sometimes the best arrests are the ones we don't make. Sometimes the greatest service comes not from enforcing laws, but from extending a hand to help someone stand up again. The room erupted in applause as Sarah looked out at the crowd, officers and veterans, business leaders and community members, all united in purpose. She knew that what had started as a routine patrol check had grown into something far bigger than herself or James. It had become a reminder that every encounter was an opportunity to change a life, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply choose to listen and understand. The story that began in a cold parking lot had become a beacon of hope for an entire community, proving that second chances, when given with understanding and support, could transform not just one life, but many.